There are some discoveries that don't just change what we know about the past, they transform our entire understanding of who we are and where we came from. I'm Eleanor, and I preserve the handwritten testimonies that families stumble upon in their darkest hours, letters that carry the power to rewrite history and restore hope when it seems lost forever. 2 months ago, I received a call from David Matthews in rural Pennsylvania. His family was hours away from selling their ancestral farm, a 200-acre property that had sustained 3 generations of Matthews but could no longer survive the mounting medical bills and property taxes that followed his father Samuel's death. David was doing one final walkthrough of the farmhouse when he discovered something that would change everything: a sealed envelope hidden behind a loose board in his grandfather's study, with instructions written in Samuel's careful handwriting. Open only if Willowbrook Farm is to be sold. Inside were 7 letters that would reveal the farm had never actually belonged to the Matthews family. It had been a gift, an extraordinary act of kindness from a wealthy widow who had found David's grandfather living on the streets during the Great Depression, a homeless teenager whose connection with a grieving horse would create bonds stronger than blood and deeper than ownership. These letters didn't just contain family secrets. They carried the story of how love, loss, and second chances can create legacies that echo across generations, and how sometimes the most important inheritance isn't property or money, but the understanding of how we became who we are. David shared this story with me because his grandfather's hidden letters had taught him something profound about the difference between owning land and truly belonging to it, and about the kind of family that chooses you when blood relatives fail you. Have you ever discovered that something you took for granted actually came from someone else's extraordinary generosity? Share your experience in the comments, because this story will show you how acts of kindness can ripple through time in ways we never imagine. The morning of October 15, 2024, should have been the end of the Matthews family's connection to Willowbrook Farm. David Matthews stood in the kitchen of the 1890s farmhouse where his grandfather Samuel had raised his children and grandchildren, watching through wavy glass windows as a black SUV pulled up the gravel drive carrying the buyers who would finalize the sale within the hour. The farm stretched across 200 acres of rolling Pennsylvania countryside, with pastures that had once been home to prize-winning horses, a red barn that had sheltered 4 generations of livestock, and an old stone foundation that marked where Samuel's first cabin had stood when he was a young man starting his life from nothing. Or so the family had always believed. David's father Michael had died 6 months earlier, leaving behind medical bills that had consumed the family's savings and property taxes that had been rising faster than the farm's modest income could cover. The decision to sell had been agonizing but necessary. David worked as an accountant in Philadelphia, his sister lived in Oregon with her own family, and none of Samuel's great-grandchildren had shown interest in maintaining a working farm that required more investment than it generated. The buyers were developers who planned to subdivide the property into residential lots, capitalizing on the growing demand for suburban housing within commuting distance of Philadelphia. They offered fair market value, which would allow David to pay off his father's debts and still have enough left over to help with his own children's college expenses. But as David walked through the empty rooms one final time, he felt the weight of ending something that had begun before he was born, something his grandfather Samuel had built with his own hands and sustained through decades of economic uncertainty, harsh winters, and the constant challenges of agricultural life. Samuel Matthews had been a man of few words but profound dedication. He had transformed Willowbrook from a small subsistence farm into a respected operation that bred and trained horses, primarily for local families who wanted reliable mounts for their children or gentle animals for therapeutic riding programs. Samuel had possessed an almost mystical ability to connect with horses that others had given up on: traumatized animals, stubborn thoroughbreds, rescue horses that had been mistreated or abandoned. David remembered childhood summers spent watching his grandfather work with these difficult horses, never raising his voice, never using force, somehow communicating in ways that calmed even the most frightened animals. Samuel would spend hours in the pastures, sitting quietly near a new horse until it approached him, building trust through patience and consistency rather than dominance or coercion. "Every horse has a story," Samuel used to tell David during those long summer afternoons. "Most of the time, they just need someone who's willing to listen to it." The farmhouse itself reflected Samuel's practical nature and quiet craftsmanship. He had expanded the original structure over the years, adding a sun-filled kitchen where his wife Martha had canned vegetables from their garden, a library lined with books about animal husbandry and veterinary care, and a study where he kept meticulous records of every horse he had bred, trained, or rehabilitated. It was in this study that David was doing his final inventory, boxing up the last of Samuel's personal papers for storage, when he noticed something odd about the wall behind his grandfather's desk. One of the wooden panels seemed slightly loose, and when David pressed against it, he realized it concealed a small hiding place that had been invisible until you knew exactly where to look. Inside the hidden compartment was a single manila envelope, sealed with wax and bearing a note in Samuel's distinctive handwriting: "For my family, open only if Willowbrook Farm is to be sold. The truth about how we came to own this land. With love and hope that this knowledge might change your minds. Samuel Matthews, 1985." David's hand shook as he opened the envelope and found 7 letters, each written on expensive stationery and dated between 1934 and 1940. They were signed with an elegant signature he didn't recognize: "With eternal gratitude and love, Margaret Whitmore." The first letter, dated December 15, 1934, was addressed to someone named Mr. Harrison and began, "I am writing to inform you of my decision to provide housing and employment for the young man we discussed. Samuel appears to be approximately 16 years old, though he is uncertain of his exact age. He was found unconscious from hunger near the front gates of Willowbrook, and I cannot, in good conscience, turn away a child in such desperate circumstances." David read the letter twice before the implications began to sink in. His grandfather hadn't bought Willowbrook Farm as a young man building his life from scratch. Someone named Margaret Whitmore had owned the property and had taken Samuel in when he was a homeless teenager during the Great Depression. The sound of car doors closing outside reminded David that the buyers would be arriving at the front door within minutes, expecting to complete a sale that would end his family's connection to this land forever. But as he continued reading Margaret Whitmore's letters, David realized he was holding evidence of a story that would change everything he thought he knew about his grandfather's life and the true origins of the place he had always called home. The second letter, dated January 20, 1935, painted a picture of Samuel Matthews that no one in David's family had ever heard before. "Mr. Harrison, I wanted to update you on young Samuel's progress. When I first brought him to Willowbrook, he was so malnourished and exhausted that Dr. Peterson worried about permanent damage to his health. The boy told me he had been living on the streets for nearly 8 months after losing both parents in a factory fire in Pittsburgh. He had been surviving by doing odd jobs when he could find them and sleeping in abandoned buildings when he couldn't." Margaret Whitmore's letters revealed that Samuel had been completely alone in the world at 16, with no relatives willing or able to take him in and no social services adequate to help homeless teenagers during the worst economic crisis in American history. He had walked nearly 100 miles from Pittsburgh to the Pennsylvania countryside, following rumors of farms that might need seasonal workers, when hunger and exhaustion finally overwhelmed him at the gates of what would eventually become his home. "The boy is remarkably intelligent and hardworking," Margaret continued in the same letter. "Despite his lack of formal education, He learns quickly and never needs to be told how to do something twice. More importantly, he possesses a gentle nature that I have rarely encountered in someone who has endured such hardships. I believe he may have found his purpose here at Willowbrook. The third letter, dated March 10, 1935, contained the detail that made David understand why his grandfather had hidden these letters for nearly 40 years. I must tell you about the most remarkable development with Thunder. As you know, my husband's horse has been inconsolable since Charles passed away 2 years ago. Thunder refuses to eat properly, won't allow anyone near him, and Dr. Morrison was beginning to suggest that the kindest thing might be to put him down rather than watch him waste away from grief. David had heard stories about Thunder throughout his childhood. Samuel had spoken of the horse with a reverence usually reserved for family members, describing Thunder as the most magnificent animal he had ever worked with, a black stallion with intelligence that seemed almost human and loyalty that transcended the normal bonds between person and horse. But Samuel had never mentioned that Thunder had belonged to someone else, or that the horse had been grieving for a previous owner. According to Margaret's letters, the connection between Samuel and Thunder had been immediate and transformative for both of them. Samuel approached Thunder differently than anyone else had tried, Margaret wrote. Instead of attempting to force the horse to accept him, Samuel simply sat in the pasture every day, reading or whittling, never pushing for interaction but making himself available if Thunder chose to approach. After 3 weeks of this patience, Thunder finally came to him, and I witnessed the most beautiful moment I have ever seen, two broken souls recognizing something familiar in each other. The letters described how Samuel had spent months rehabilitating Thunder, not just physically but emotionally, helping the horse process grief while working through his own trauma from losing his parents and surviving on the streets. Margaret observed this healing process from her farmhouse windows, and her letters conveyed growing amazement at Samuel's intuitive understanding of animal psychology. Samuel has a gift that cannot be taught, she wrote in April 1935. He sees Thunder not as a problem to be solved but as a fellow creature carrying pain that needs to be acknowledged before it can be healed. Watching them together has taught me more about compassion than 40 years of church sermons. As David read these letters, he could hear the buyers talking with their lawyer on the front porch, discussing final paperwork and timeline for taking possession of the property. In less than an hour, he was supposed to sign documents that would end his family's connection to land that, according to these letters, had never actually belonged to them in the first place. But he couldn't stop reading. The fourth letter, dated July 1935, revealed that Margaret had been documenting Samuel's transformation from a traumatized street orphan into someone she described as the son I never had the blessing to bear myself. Now I need to ask you something that David wrestled with as he sat in his grandfather's study. If you discovered that something you had always considered your inheritance had actually been someone else's gift, how would that change your relationship to it? Would it feel less yours, or more precious because of the love that had made it possible? Because David was about to learn that his grandfather's connection to Willowbrook went far deeper than ownership. It was rooted in the kind of love that doesn't require legal documents to be real. The fifth letter, dated September 1936, contained revelations that made David understand why his grandfather had been so secretive about Willowbrook's origins. My dear Mr. Harrison, I am writing to inform you of my decision to make Samuel Matthews my legal heir. As you know, Charles and I were never blessed with children, and Samuel has become the family I always prayed for but never expected to find. Margaret Whitmore's letters painted a portrait of a woman who had found purpose in the last years of her life by nurturing a boy who had been abandoned by circumstances beyond anyone's control. She described teaching Samuel to read and write beyond the elementary level he had achieved before his parents' death, sharing books from her extensive library, and watching him develop the business skills that would eventually make Willowbrook Farm profitable. Samuel has transformed our stables into something Charles would have been proud of, Margaret wrote in October 1936. Word of his skill with difficult horses is spreading throughout the county, and we now have more requests for training services than we can accommodate. More importantly, Samuel has given Thunder a reason to live again, and Thunder has given Samuel the confidence to believe in his own worth. But the sixth letter, dated December 1938, contained news that Margaret had apparently kept hidden from Samuel. Dr. Peterson has confirmed that the cancer has spread beyond what we initially hoped. He estimates that I have perhaps 18 months remaining, though I have sworn him to secrecy. Samuel must not know of my condition until absolutely necessary. These have been the happiest years of my life, watching this remarkable young man grow into someone who honors both his own potential and Charles's memory through his care for Thunder and the other horses. Margaret was dying, but she was using her remaining time to ensure that Samuel would inherit not just property but the knowledge and skills needed to sustain Willowbrook as a working farm. The letters revealed that she had spent months teaching him about legal documents, property management, and the financial planning necessary to maintain a small agricultural operation through economic uncertainty. Samuel believes he is simply learning to help me manage the farm's business affairs, Margaret wrote in March 1939. He has no idea that I am preparing him to own and operate Willowbrook independently. I pray that when the time comes, he will understand that this inheritance is not charity but recognition of the family bonds we have created together. The seventh and final letter, dated June 15, 1940, was addressed not to Mr. Harrison but to Samuel himself. My dearest Samuel, if you are reading this letter, it means that I am no longer able to tell you in person how much your presence in my life has meant to me. You saved Thunder from dying of grief, but more importantly, you saved me from dying of loneliness. David's eyes filled with tears as he read Margaret's final words to his grandfather. Charles and I always wanted children, but we learned to accept that some blessings come in forms we don't expect. You have been my son in every way that matters, and Thunder has been the bridge that brought us together as family. Willowbrook Farm is yours not because I pity the circumstances that brought you here, but because you have earned it through love, dedication, and the kind of character that makes me proud to call you my heir. Margaret's final letter contained practical information about legal documents, bank accounts, and the arrangements she had made to ensure Samuel's inheritance would be protected from anyone who might question his right to the property. But it also contained something more precious: validation that the relationship between Samuel and Margaret had been mutual love rather than one-sided charity. Never doubt that you deserve this inheritance, Margaret concluded. You gave an old woman purpose in her final years, healed a grieving horse, and proved that family is not about blood but about the choice to love each other unconditionally. Build the life here that you were meant to live, and know that Charles and I will always be watching over you with pride. David sat in complete silence, holding letters that had been hidden for 84 years and trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. His grandfather hadn't just been a skilled horseman who had built a successful farm through hard work and determination. He had been a homeless orphan who had been saved by extraordinary kindness and had spent his entire adult life honoring that gift by continuing Margaret's legacy of compassion toward animals and people who needed second chances. Outside, the buyers were growing impatient, and David could hear his real estate agent apologizing for the delay. But David was no longer thinking about sale contracts or medical bills or college funds. He was thinking about Margaret Whitmore, who had died before he was born but whose letters revealed her to be the great-grandmother he had never known he had. I want to pause here to thank all of you who follow these stories and understand how family secrets can reshape our entire understanding of where we come from. David's discovery shows us that some inheritances are about more than money or property, they're about understanding the love that made our lives possible in the first place. Your support for these stories helps preserve the memories of people like Margaret, whose kindness creates legacies that last for generations. David walked out to the front porch where the buyers and lawyers were waiting with contracts spread across a folding table, their pens ready to finalize the sale that would turn Willowbrook Farm into Willowbrook Meadows, a subdivision of 38 custom homes starting at $650,000 each. The lead buyer, a man named Peterson, looked up expectantly as David approached. "Mr. Matthews, we're ready to proceed whenever you are. I know this must be emotional, selling the family farm, but you're making the right financial decision." David looked out over the pastures where his grandfather had spent 40 years training horses, where Thunder had lived until the remarkable age of 32, where Samuel Matthews had built a reputation for healing animals that others had written off as hopeless cases. The rolling hills and old oak trees looked the same as they had that morning, but David now understood that he was looking at a landscape shaped by love rather than mere ownership. "I need to make a phone call," David said quietly. "Can you give me 30 minutes? Peterson checked his watch and frowned. "We have a closing deadline, Mr. Matthews. The financing approval expires at 5 o'clock today. If we don't sign these papers now, we'll have to restart the entire process, and I can't guarantee the same terms." David nodded but was already walking toward the barn, pulling out his cell phone to call his sister Jennifer in Oregon. The conversation was difficult. Jennifer had been counting on her share of the sale proceeds to help with her daughter's medical expenses, but as David read portions of Margaret's letters over the phone, Jennifer's objections gradually gave way to amazement. "Dad never told us any of this," Jennifer said, her voice thick with emotion. "I always wondered why Grandpa Samuel was so secretive about his childhood, why he never talked about his parents or where he came from." "The letters explain everything," David replied, leaning against the fence where Samuel used to stand every morning, checking on whichever horses were currently in his care. Grandpa wasn't secretive because he was ashamed, he was protecting Margaret's privacy and maintaining the dignity of someone who had helped him when he had nothing. David explained his growing conviction that selling Willowbrook would dishonor both Samuel's memory and Margaret's intentions. The farm had been given to Samuel not as temporary assistance but as a permanent home, a place where he could build the kind of life that honored the gift he had received. "But David," Jennifer said practically, "we still have Dad's medical bills, and you still have college expenses coming up. Good intentions don't pay for reality." David had been thinking about this problem for the past hour, and Margaret's letters had given him an idea that might honor the farm's history while addressing the family's financial needs. What if we don't sell to developers? What if we find a way to keep the farm but make it financially sustainable? Jennifer was skeptical, but David had already begun researching alternatives on his phone while sitting in Samuel's study. Willowbrook's location, size, and infrastructure made it ideal for several types of operations that could generate revenue while preserving its character as a working farm. The most promising option was therapeutic riding, using horses to help children and adults with physical, emotional, or developmental challenges. Samuel's notebooks, which David had discovered alongside the letters, documented decades of observations about how different horses responded to people with various needs, insights that could form the foundation of a professional therapeutic program. Grandpa was already doing this work informally, David explained to Jennifer. "I found records of families who brought their children here because Samuel had a reputation for matching people with horses that could help them. We could formalize that into a non-profit program that would qualify for grants and donations." The more David thought about it, the more convinced he became that this was what Samuel would have wanted. The old man had spent his entire adult life taking in difficult horses and traumatized animals, giving them the patient care they needed to trust humans again. Expanding that mission to include people who needed healing would be a natural extension of the work Samuel had been doing all along. David called the buyers back to the farmhouse and explained that he had decided not to sell. Peterson was angry about the wasted time and legal expenses, but the contracts had included a clause allowing David to withdraw before signing, and there was nothing anyone could do to force the sale. "You're making a mistake," Peterson warned. "This property will never be worth more than it is right now. If you change your mind next year, we won't be offering the same terms." But David was no longer thinking about property values or market timing. He was thinking about Margaret Whitmore's final letter to Samuel, and her hope that he would build the life here that you were meant to live. After the buyers left, David spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the farm with new eyes, seeing it not just as the place where he had spent childhood summers but as the physical manifestation of one woman's extraordinary generosity and one man's determination to honor that gift through decades of quiet service. In the barn, David found evidence of Samuel's work that he had never fully appreciated: detailed charts showing the progress of horses with various behavioral problems, photographs of children who had learned to ride on gentle horses that Samuel had specifically trained for therapeutic work, and letters from families thanking Samuel for the patience and skill that had helped their loved ones overcome physical or emotional challenges through interaction with animals. One letter, from 1987, particularly moved David. "Dear Mr. Matthews, I wanted you to know that our son Tommy has been riding with you for 6 months now, and it's the first time since his accident that we've seen him smile. The doctors said he might never regain confidence in his physical abilities, but somehow your horse Gentle Ben has helped him believe in himself again. We can never thank you enough for the gift you've given our family." Samuel had been running a therapeutic riding program for decades without calling it that, without seeking recognition or formal certification, simply because he understood that horses had the power to heal human hearts the same way they had healed his own trauma as a homeless teenager. David spent the next 6 months transforming Willowbrook Farm into the Margaret Whitmore Therapeutic Riding Center, named in honor of the woman whose kindness had made everything possible. The transition required extensive planning, licensing, insurance, and certification, but David discovered that Samuel's informal records provided most of the documentation needed to establish the program's credibility and safety standards. Jennifer flew in from Oregon to help with the conversion, bringing her own children to experience the farm that had shaped their grandfather's life. David's teenage son Michael, who had shown little interest in rural life, became fascinated by the project once he understood the story behind it, volunteering to help restore the barn and learning to work with some of the gentler horses. The most moving discovery came when David decided to clean out the old storage room behind the barn and found a wooden chest that Samuel had apparently forgotten in his final years. Inside were hundreds of photographs documenting 6 decades of work with horses and the people they had helped, along with a journal Samuel had kept sporadically throughout his adult life. The journal entries revealed the depth of Samuel's gratitude to Margaret and his ongoing sense of responsibility to honor her memory through his work. One entry, from 1955, read, "Thunder passed away today at 32 years old, the most magnificent horse I ever knew. He lived more than twice as long as most horses, and I think it's because Margaret's love kept him strong even after she was gone. I buried him under the big oak tree where he used to graze when he was healing from his grief. I hope Margaret knows that her kindness saved us both." Another entry, from 1972, showed Samuel's awareness of the broader impact of his work. "The Henderson girl rode Buttercup today without needing help to mount or dismount. 6 months ago, she was afraid to be in the same paddock as a horse. Her mother cried watching her daughter discover courage she didn't know she had. This is what Margaret meant when she said that healing one broken soul helps heal others. The journal also contained Samuel's thoughts about his decision to keep Margaret's letters secret. The children don't need to know that Willowbrook was given to me rather than earned. They understand the important part, that this farm is built on love and service to others who need second chances. Someday, if they ever need to sell the land, they'll find the letters and understand that they have a choice to make about what matters more, money or continuing the work that Margaret started. David realized that Samuel had always intended for the family to discover Margaret's letters, but only at a moment when they would be forced to decide between financial gain and preserving a legacy of compassion. The hidden envelope had been Samuel's way of ensuring that his descendants would understand what they were giving up if they chose to sell the farm to developers. The Therapeutic Writing Center opened in the spring of 2025, serving children with autism, adults recovering from trauma, and elderly clients dealing with depression or mobility issues. David left his accounting job to run the center full-time, using his business skills to manage the nonprofit organization and his grandfather's horse training knowledge to continue the healing work that had been happening at Willowbrook for 8 decades. The program's success exceeded all expectations. Families drove from as far as Philadelphia and Baltimore to participate in sessions that combined traditional horseback riding instruction with therapeutic techniques designed to build confidence, improve physical coordination, and provide emotional support for people dealing with various challenges. David kept Margaret's letters framed in the center's office, along with photographs of Samuel and Thunder and some of the hundreds of horses that had lived at Willowbrook over the years. Visitors often asked about the history of the farm, and David found himself telling Margaret and Samuel's story dozens of times each month to families who were amazed to learn that their therapeutic writing sessions were taking place on land that had been saved by love rather than purchased with money. 1 year after opening, David received a letter that brought the story full circle. It was from Margaret Whitmore's great-niece, a woman named Catherine who had been researching her family genealogy and had discovered references to an aunt who had owned a horse farm in Pennsylvania. Catherine visited Willowbrook on a snowy December afternoon, bringing with her a collection of photographs and documents that filled in gaps in Margaret's story. She revealed that Margaret had been considered eccentric by her wealthy family for her decision to waste money on charity cases like homeless boys and grieving horses, but that she had never regretted her choice to follow her heart instead of social expectations. Aunt Margaret always said that the best investments were the ones you made in people, not stocks, Catherine told David as they walked through the barn where Samuel had first connected with Thunder 90 years earlier. She would be so proud to see that her kindness is still helping people heal, still giving second chances to those who need them most. Catherine also brought something that made David understand the final piece of Margaret's legacy, a letter Margaret had written to her family shortly before her death, explaining her decision to leave Willowbrook to Samuel. "I am not leaving my property to a stranger. I am leaving it to my son, the child I was blessed to find and raise in the final years of my life. Samuel Matthews has more integrity and compassion in his soul than most people accumulate in a lifetime, and I trust him to use this land in ways that honor the love Charles and I shared here." David added Catherine's documents to the collection in the center's office, creating a complete record of the relationships that had shaped Willowbrook Farm across nearly a century. The story had begun with a homeless teenager and a grieving horse, continued through decades of quiet service to animals and people who needed healing, and was now helping a new generation discover the transformative power of connecting with horses. As David told me when he shared this story, we almost sold our family's legacy for money, not understanding that our real inheritance wasn't the land itself but the responsibility to continue the work of love that had been happening there for 90 years. Margaret's hidden letters didn't just save our farm, they taught us what it means to be worthy of the gifts we've been given. The Margaret Whitmore Therapeutic Writing Center continues to operate today, serving more than 200 clients annually and maintaining a herd of horses that includes several rescues who have found new purpose in helping others heal. David's children now work at the center during summers and school breaks, learning the same lessons about compassion and service that Samuel learned from Margaret nearly a century ago. Thunder's grave under the old oak tree has become a place of reflection for visitors who want to understand the full story of Willowbrook Farm. David planted a garden around the site, with flowers that bloom throughout the writing season and a small bench where people can sit and contemplate the connections between healing and hope, between loss and love, and between the choices that define who we become. What would you have done in David's situation? Would you have honored the financial needs of your family, or would you have felt compelled to preserve a legacy of kindness that had shaped 3 generations? And how do you think acts of generosity like Margaret's can create ripples that last for decades? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This story reminds us that some inheritances are about more than property or money. They're about understanding the love that made our lives possible and finding ways to pass that love forward to future generations. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more discoveries that show how family secrets can reveal the most beautiful truths about where we come from and who we're meant to become. Your support helps me preserve these stories about the power of kindness to transform lives across generations. I'm Eleanor, and I preserve the handwritten testimonies that families stumble upon in their darkest hours. Margaret's hidden letters remind us that sometimes the most important inheritance isn't what we own, but understanding how we came to own it and what that knowledge asks of us in return. Until next time, remember that every act of kindness creates a story, and some stories are powerful enough to save not just individuals but entire legacies from being lost forever.